Oh, yeah.
Ready, Freddie?
Yeah. Is Patty ready?
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. Hi, welcome. We'll be getting started. This one? Oh, yeah. No, that wasn't turned on. Hi, folks. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Olivia Sobre. I'm the Chicagoans marketing manager. I am thrilled to be welcoming our wonderful, fabulous board president, Erica Ruggiero, tonight to be talking about Chicago's abandoned transit. But before that, let's give some time for the folks at the bar to get their drinks and get back to their seats, folks at home to do the same, or snacks, whatever you want. So we are Chicago for Chicagoans. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. What that means is we're a small but mighty nonprofit organization, and we lead programming that is education for all standpoint, aka free/please donate if you are so inspired to do so. And our programming focuses around helping Chicagoans learn about their neighborhood. Tourist welcome, but mainly local focused. So what that means in the winter time is that we are here in the wonderful room 13 Speakeasy on Sheffield. Woot woot for Oscar in the back, our great bartender. And we're doing the talks every Thursday about a different part of forgotten Chicago. So hence tonight we'll be learning about abandoned transit in the city. But we are nearing the end of winter, folks. We've officially had our St. Patty's Day. We almost made it. We're probably only 2 blizzards away from summer. So what that means is we're getting ready for walking tour season. Yes. So folks who have been here once or twice or are regulars, you know that this is how we got started, getting out in the neighborhoods with local guides leading us through, telling us their stories, and finishing up the day at a local business to break bread together. So we're very much excited to announce that programming soon. No date promised. But we'll be here at room 13 for the next 3 weeks. We have 2 weeks worth of speakers. If you're looking at our calendar of upcoming events, we did have a slight schedule change. So we're moving up Anthony 1 week, and that last week is now going to be a party. Come hang out with your favorite presenters from this season, ask all your juicy questions, and have some more yummy drinks. So, as I mentioned, Chicagoans is a pay-what-you-can nonprofit. So, folks, if you are so inspired to help our small but mighty organization volunteer run, there are QR codes around the room. We also accept cash, kidneys, firstborn children we don't mess with anymore. It's too much drama. Or at chicagochicagoans.org/donate. Now, this presenter needs no introduction.
Oh, God.
She is our McKinley Park tour guide. She is an architectural preservationist, and she is just wonderful. So everyone give it up for Erica.
Thank you. That's a lot. No. Awesome. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? I hate mics, but Patty makes me do it. So, also, firstborn children are beyond the drama. We can't afford it. So, no, thank you. Cash only. As Olivia mentioned, I'm Erica Ruggiero. Thank you, Olivia. Olivia is also our new and amazing marketing manager. It's an all-volunteer position, and so she's been taking that on for us. So we love to have her, as well as Steph, who has just been a long-time volunteer, and we couldn't do it without either of them, or Patty, of course. So thank you to all 3 of them for making tonight possible. So I am a historic preservation specialist and owner with a woman-owned architecture firm in Evanston, McGuire Gillespie and Associates. We only work on historic buildings, and so I do a lot of the research, preservation planning, writing projects in the office, whereas my colleagues do a lot of the design and construction for on the architectural side. And so a little bit how I've gotten involved with kind of CTA history is our firm has a long relationship with working on transit projects. So we have If you've been to the Francisco stop on the Brown Line, that was our restoration and rehabilitation many eons ago. We also did the Damon stop on the Brown Line, as well as South and Maine and Dempster on the Purple Line. And then also most recently, the accessibility improvements at Quincy we were part of, as well as the restoration of the Garfield Park Station, if you've been down there, which is the last remaining kind of original station on the South Side Line, which I'll talk about tonight. So that was a really exciting project. And we also got to, if you watched the news at all, just a few blocks from here, the Vautravers moved for the new Brown Line flyover, I think last July, and we were the architect for the relocation of that project. And then we've done a lot of, on my side, preservation planning for the red-purple modernization of for CTA in recent years. So have a very long history with CTA and kind of their transit lines that I hopefully will bring tonight into this presentation. I would say if you have a QR code, I know Patty printed some packets, but on the QR code, the photos are organized kind of by section. So there's 3 sections that I'll talk about tonight. It's kind of general history prior to the CTA, and so there's tons of photos to kind of flip through, and the captions briefly state what what you're looking at. And then as we get into talking about closures, there's a section for the Lake Street elevated, and I'll tell you when to flip to that, and then the Kenwood branch as well. And then there's a map that I know there are some copies about. I know there's not a lot of 11 by 17s, but so if you're able to get the QR code, you should be able to see it clearer, and I'll reference it throughout the presentation. So tonight we're really focused on the peak of specifically the elevated system. So we're not talking about subways at all or bus lines, really just the elevated lines. And they really peaked during the late 1920s and the very early 1930s, though there were few extensions, specifically in the 1970s, the 1980s, and then the 1990s. So in the 1970, you have, my map is obviously really small because I want all of you to have the 11 by 17s that are out there. But if you look towards the bottom, you'll see the 95th Dan Ryan branch. That's 1970. A portion of the blue line that's dotted here, so the Milwaukee Avenue branch, that's 1970s. Next, that was further extended west to get to O'Hare in the early 1980s. And then obviously we have the Midway branch, or the Orange Line today, in 1993. And a lot of what I'll talk about today has nothing to do with the Union Loop Elevated, which is the original name for our loop, our actually elevated loop through downtown. So that could really be its own talk. So I'm really focused on 4 companies that I'll explain a little bit more. Also, I would note the map is obviously not present day. Do not use it. You will get lost. So I now have no responsibility for that. And 2 things to note on the map, just in case you are a transit nerd as well. I know I'm missing 2 pre-1933 things they're very small, but I want to mention them. So there was a Market Street segment. Market Street is now Wacker Drive, the north-south Wacker Drive. And it served the Lake Street Elevated, which ran from this specific segment, ran from Canal to Madison along Wacker Drive with stations at Randolph and Wacker. This got the Lake Street Elevated into downtown a year prior to the construction of the loop. And then the other segment that I don't have is the Randolph Street branch of the Lake Street Elevated, which only had a 4-year run. And it was not intended for local service, but specifically to access the Harlem racetrack at Roosevelt and Hannah Avenue in what was the village of Harlem, which is now Forest Park. And residents were not fond of it, so it did not last that long. So that's just kind of a few housekeeping things before we get started. And the first thing I kind of want to talk about is pre-CTA history. So this covers very shortly, pre-elevated lines, and then we'll get into the early elevated lines. So public passenger transportation in Chicago started as early as 1859. It's predominantly always been led by private industrialists. They operated Chicago streetcar lines, bus, and rapid transit systems for nearly 9 decades, until eventually being driven out of business by rising operational costs, the competition from the automobile, and political controls for fares, routes, and services. Also, this is like pinging at me. Is that bothering anybody else or just me? Okay. It's this lovely metallic sound.
Okay.
All right.
How's that? Is that better?
Oh yeah, that's good. Okay, cool. Thank you. So before any transportation improvements, the main streets were unpaved, impassable, really layers of mud. And if you've ever been on the McKinley Park tour, Patty and I tell this wonderful story about a guy being so deep in mud that he didn't know where his horse was anymore. But you have to come on the McKinley Park tour to get the full story. And transportation was really limited to a 2-horse omnibus line. And an omnibus, if I would Google it, maybe Google like omnibus Chicago Transit and go right to images, because you'll get a lot of spam stuff. But essentially, it's a very large stagecoach that acted as a bus, essentially. And it really only moved the population within the central core of the city, which at the time was north of 22nd Street or Cermak today. And everything past that was just rolling prairie, and maybe a house dotted the landscape here or there. As the population rapidly grew outward from the city core, it became apparent that a form of mass transit would be needed to reduce the distance between new residential areas and the commercial and industrial areas in downtown. So in 1859, the Chicago City Railway Company opened the city's first horse-powered street railway on State Street. In less than 3 decades, horse-powered transit could no longer meet the city's transportation needs. It became obsolete, and we went to the cable car. Soon after, Chicago was obviously still booming, still growing. The cable car could not keep up. It suffered from high construction and operation costs, as well as mechanical failures, and then a limited street space which then also limited the opportunities for expansion. Thus, we have the elevated line. The elevated, or L as we'll call it, would not take up valuable street space. It would move passengers faster and more effectively than a streetcar, though still left to be determined sometimes. We'll see how the RPM project does. The concept for an elevated railroad originated in 1867 in New York City. Chicago did attempt an elevated railroad as early as 1869, but it did not receive city council approval. And while we weren't the first elevated, we do have several innovative firsts in terms of technology and kind of mechanical engineering that I'll talk on tonight. Between 1872 and 1900, over 70 elevated railroad companies incorporated, but only 4 companies managed to operate rapid transit trains for passenger services. This is the Chicago and South Side Rapid Transit Railroad, also known as the Alley L, and we'll learn why in a second. The Lake Street Elevated Railroad, the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad, or the MET, and the Northwestern Elevated Railroad. Again, not talking about the Union Loop, so in total there are 5 in our history, but we're just focusing on the 4 outside of the loop. So the first one is the Chicago and South Side Rapid Transit Railroad Company. This would be approximately today's Green Line South, so towards Ashland and, the Ashland branch. So that would be today's Green Line and also the one to Cottage Grove. This is the first of Chicago's mainline elevated railroad companies. It was incorporated in January 1888, and it envisioned an elevated railroad reaching from downtown Chicago to the Illinois-Indiana state line. The first elevated Railroad ran along city-owned alleys to avoid problems with securing enough frontage consent signatures from property owners, also giving it its nickname, the Alley L, because they kind of just surpassed property rights and just built over public and air rights, essentially, and over the alley. The Alley L was to eventually run from Van Buren between Dearborn and Wabash and south to Cottage Grove and 67th Street. The first train and carry passengers ran on May 27, 1892, on a non-stop run from Congress to 39th Street. By the end of 1892, the line was then expanded to 63rd and Calumet Avenue, and within a few months, it was extended eastward down 63rd Street to the new Jackson Park Terminal at the World's Fair, and there is a photo either in the packet or online in the general history folder. It's really cool. I had not seen a photo of it before, and it's kind of outstanding that, you know, in general, what they built for the World's Fair that then eventually predominantly got demolished. By 1905 to 1907, two branches into Inglewood extended the line to the west. So there is the, you know, what we have as the Ashland line today. So again, in the kind of the lower portion of the map, there's a short line that runs west. That's the Inglewood branch, and then off of the Inglewood branch was a spur to Normal Park as well, which is in Inglewood today. Additionally, around the same time, they built the Kenwood branch and the Stockyards branch, and we'll talk about both of those later this evening. An interesting note on the South Side L, it was actually the world's first to introduce multiple unit control. So this essentially means that a train operator from one spot in the train can operate all of the mechanical equipment on the train. And so then you can have multiple passenger cars hooked together with one operator. So it's essentially what we still use for the CTA today. And it was here that it was first introduced, which I think is pretty cool. After the South Side line, we had the Lake Street L. This is today's Green Line to Oak Park. It was always built above Lake Street, obviously, that's its namesake, and it was always intended to run to the village of Oak Park, though it took several years to get there. It first incorporated in February 1888, though the dedication of the line did not take place till November 1894, and it officially opened for passenger traffic to California 2 days later. Service reached 52nd Street, which is essentially, I know the names have changed and I can't remember all of them, but it's essentially west of Cicero, not Cicero, Central, west of Central, on April 29th, 1894, though the station was unfinished. It would be 5.5 years before it reached Austin and Oak Park. And shortly after that, it was followed by the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad Company. The only portion besides kind of remnants of the line that are left is the elevated line in kind of the Logan Square neighborhood. So the Met originally had a Logan Square branch that ran from, so their main line ran from Wells to Marshfield, and then there's Marshfield Junction where it turned and it branched off north to Logan Square, and then there was a spur of the Logan Square line to go to Humboldt. And then it also continued off of the main line, it continued west into Garfield Park as well. And so on the map, kind of at the center of the map, you have two shades of blue, two shades of blue. So the main line is a dotted black line because it's been completely demolished and obviously somewhat replaced with today's Blue Line subway that cuts much more at a diagonal out of the loop. And then you have the Garfield Park branch, which actually ran out to Forest Park eventually. And then if you're in the general history, I love these photos so much. There are some photos of the Westchester branch, which just feel like they don't look like Illinois to me. They're so just this quaint countryside and this little L running through the prairie. So please look at those in the general history folder. And then obviously Northwest, you had, their Logan Square branch ended at Logan Square. It wasn't until 1970 that you had the extension to Jefferson Park. And then Humboldt Park was a very short line just between Western and Lawndale that they built. And so there's not much of this line left. If we do the Kinsey tour again this year, the Kinsey Industrial Corridor tour again this year, hopefully for Labor Day, there is one really interesting piece, which is kind of the remnant of the bridge at the Marshfield Junction, which is really interesting, and I have to show you all if we do that. I showed the last group, so if you were there, you know what I'm talking about. Another innovation in Chicago that came out of the Met was that before opening, decision was made in May of 1894 to switch to electric traction based on the success of the intramural railway at the World's Columbian Exposition the year prior. Converting to electric traction would also reduce operating expenses by $250,000 a year. And the Met was the first rapid transit route to be electrically operated, commencing service on May 1895. So also in the general history, there is a picture of a steam locomotive or engine. I can never remember, I know I should, what the actual term is for the front of the train that powers the train. But it's really cool. It says like Chicago South Side Rapid Transit on it, but it's a steam engine, which you would not think. And then our last line to incorporate is the Northwestern Elevated Railroad. This is essentially today's Red Line and Brown Line. And there's a really great story. I'm gonna read a story for you all in a minute that I just love, because it's like I live off the Red Line. And I can't imagine that if this didn't happen, the Red Line might not exist. So we'll get there. But it incorporated in October 1893. And it was the last of the 4 main elevated railroad companies to be established. Northwestern's charter described a network of lines radiating out of downtown into the north and northwest sides of the city. The city granted a 50-year franchise for a line extending from downtown to Wilson, with a later extension to Howard and 4 branches. So a little bit more on franchises. They typically had an expiration, so you had to build and be in operation within a certain time period. So even though your franchise maybe was for 50 years, they had until basically December 31st, 1899 to build and be in operation. Of course, they did not get there. So at 2:13 p.m. on December 30th, 1899, the Northwestern went into transportation business 1 day before their franchise was to expire, if the track and stations were not in operation. There was only 1 track, and the Wilson, Buena Park, and Wrightwood stations could accept passengers. Trains would run 1 run a day to keep the franchise until the system was completed. If I remember correctly, it was like you had to like ride all the way around essentially, or like, you know, get off where you don't need to be, because you can only do Wilson, Buena, or Wrightwood. The structure was declared incomplete and unsafe on January 1st, 1900 by the Public Works Commissioner. No surprise. But I love this. So in defiance, ownership of the line continued to run the once-a-day run. The train within a few days was greeted by 4 policemen at Wrightwood, who arrested the crew for criminal carelessness. Thinking that the train would no longer be able to run, the police left the train unattended and full of passengers. Thank you, CPD. Fortunately, one of the train's passengers was company superintendent Frank Henley. Also a really interesting fact, and I had the privilege of writing the landmark designation for the Quincy elevated station and learned this, and I was like, it just makes sense. But Frank's brother Alfred was actually the architect that designed several loop stations, and conveniently the loop and the Northwestern line were owned by the same person. So the Headley brothers just kind of, you know, superintendent, architect, they kind of just had their hands in everything with Charles Tyson Yerkes, which is pretty interesting. So Frank calmly entered the cab and took control of the train. As the train approached the junction with the loop at Lake Street, 50 police officers awaited the train, but instead of yielding, Headley sped up, causing the police to scatter. Knowing the train would have to cross the junction again while leaving the loop, police placed timbers across the tracks, but in the meantime, this is like so great, arrangements had been made to reroute the train onto the Lake Street Company's line, also owned by Yerkes. He like owns everything. Leaving the lawman in astonishment as the train raced north on Wells and turned onto Lake Street, bypassing the barricade. The police finally caught up with the train at the Market Street stub on Wacker and stationed officers with it throughout the night. The court ruled the police had overstepped their authority and ordered the release of the trainmen because they were still holding all the trainmen in contempt, jail, whatever, you know. They were still not allowed to be out. And then eventually the Northwestern Elevated received a franchise extension until May 31st, 1900, so about 5 months. And they met the deadline and service was reinaugurated then. And now we have the red and brown line. So it's kind of, I kind of like, yeah, and it still runs awful. Yep, I know. But it's all, yeah, it's just like, I just wonder if like Headley didn't take control of the train, what would our brown line and red line be today? So those are kind of the 4 elevated lines that started our rapid transit system in Chicago. So how do we get to the CTA? Of course, there's a slew of mergers and consolidations and business dealings with main characters like Yerkes, like Samuel Insull, who were behind a lot of it. And you eventually get to the Chicago Rapid Transit Company, which merged these technically 5 individual elevated lines, though all owned really by the same people, into one privately held company that operated from 1924 to 1947, and eventually would sell all of the company's assets to the CTA. So the Chicago Transit Authority was incorporated on September 1st, 1945. So if you really love CTA, that's the day to celebrate, I think. That would be their birthday. And they began full operations by October 1st, 1947. The CTA was created under a referendum vote where a publicly owned independent municipal corporation would be created and operate all of Chicago's transportation systems, mainly streetcars and rapid transit trains. So CTA was thus created under an act of the General Assembly of the State of Illinois. Simultaneously, the City of Chicago passed a companion ordinance which grants CTA the exclusive right to own and operate a comprehensive, unified local transportation system in the city. Both act and ordinance were adopted in a referendum which passed June 4th, 1945. The prospectus of kind of all of the equipment that CTA acquired on August 1947, and this is really focused on just rapid transit property. Obviously, they acquired all of the bus assets as well. It included 170.9 miles of equivalent single track line. So if you were to run track, just one single track, it'd be nearly 171 miles, along with 235 stations. So we're at the CTA, we're at mid-20th century, and that's just a little bit of, general history of how we get here. But the second part of this talk is about closures and kind of CTA's consolidation. And, this is my own personal research and opinion based on this, but it does appear to me to be discriminatory, and we'll let you all be the judge of your own mind after I share some information. So now with a little background history, we'll talk about the main topic, and which, if you pull up your map again, you can see predominantly impacted the south and northwest sides in terms of complete line closures. So you have really Humboldt Park south. So the Humboldt Park line closed, Westchester closed, which is technically outside of the city of Chicago. I recognize that. A portion of the Douglas Park branch closed, the Met Main Line closed, the Stockyards branch closed, Kenwood branch closed, Normal Park branch closed, and a portion of the Jackson Park branch closed. So all on the south and west sides of the city. And in addition to line closures, so I'll talk about two topics: line closures with the Kenwood branch, and then also station closures with the Lake Street branch. So we'll cover the south and west side. So essentially station closures on a grand scale where CTA kept the line, like the Lake Street line, but you have large areas of now the west side and the near west side and East Garfield Park without access to a station unless you walk a mile or a mile and a half. I'm going to focus on station closures along Lake Street and the near west side, and then the closure of the Kenwood branch on the south side elevated line. So what's happening, at this moment in history on the south and west sides of the city, and in the mid 20th century? So right now there's this massive kind of event happening known as the Great Migration, and we're in the second peak of the Great Migration. So, and we're going to go back a little bit and give a little bit of history on this event. So between 1916 and 1920, more than 50,000 African Americans from the southern United States migrated to Chicago with the hope of better opportunities and to escape the violent and oppressive conditions of the southern states under Jim Crow laws. This was a migration known as the Great Migration, which spanned approximately from 1916 to 1970, give or take a few years on either side. Many migrants were then forced to settle in Chicago's Black Belt. The Black Belt was first established as early as 1870 and was bounded by Van Buren Street on the north, 39th or Pershing on the south, the affluent white residential neighborhoods on the east, and by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific rail yards on the west, which is approximately kind of the Dan Ryan today. By 1920, this area would extend south beyond 63rd Street and east to Lake Michigan. However, reality fell far short as many of the conditions in the Black Belt were still repressive and segregated. Within Chicago, African Americans were restricted to renting in the Black Belt in white-owned housing that was often dilapidated, overcrowded, and typically more expensive than comparable housing in white areas. By 1930, African Americans constituted nearly 75% of the population in Kenwood, Oakland, Grand Boulevard, and Douglas community areas, which are some of the primary community areas now of the Black Belt, or what was the Black Belt, and also served by the Kenwood branch. So kind of really focusing on, tying everything together tonight. And the community of the Black Belt, while restricted, they worked to persevere despite poor conditions surrounding them, economic isolation, and restrictive covenants. In pockets on the south as well as the west sides became flourishing epicenters of Black-owned businesses, civic organizations, and churches, as well as home to a number of prominent intellectuals, politicians, sports figures, artists, writers. But then we hit the Great Depression, and Chicago's and we see a decline in Chicago's transportation infrastructure. And we'll talk more about this as part of the Kenwood branch and how it's reflected in the built environment. So as the south and west side of the city continue to see an increase in African Americans fleeing the southern United States, as we get into mid-20th century, just from 1940 to 1944, 60,000 people arrived into the Black Belt during that time. Chicago's communities were diversifying, and then into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, were hit with white flight. This sudden mass exodus of white people from communities across the south and west sides that are becoming essentially more racially and culturally diverse with an arrival of new communities during the Great Migration. And so a lot of the kind of either first generation Europeans or, now we have actual, native Chicagoans, they're leaving for the suburbs, and they're leaving behind essentially nothing for the new population coming in. A lot of time closures are because stations are underutilized. There's a loss of population, using the station, but is it necessarily true for these areas? So looking at population statistics between 1930 and 1960, which conveniently the Encyclopedia of Chicago has provided all of these. So if you're curious on any neighborhood, you can look it up. The near west side did have a population loss, approximately 26,000, but you have an increase in jobs in the Kinsey Industrial Corridor, which I'll talk about in a second. And again, if you come on the Kinsey Industrial Corridor, you'll hear about it. And this corridor spans approximately like the entire western half of the near west side. And then in East Garfield Park, adjacent to the near west side, and obviously the Lake Street line runs through here, there's actually a slight increase in population by 3,000. But the demographics have completely changed from 97% white and 3% African American in 1930 to 38% white and 62% African American in 1960. But population is relatively holding steady. And then we go to the south side. In Kenwood and Oakland, which were served by the Kenwood branch, you see a similar demographic shift from 99% white and 1% African American in 1930 to 15% white and 84% African American in 1960, with a population increase of nearly 15,000 in Kenwood. And in Oakland, the population shifts from 70% white and 30% African American in 1930 to 1% white and 98% African American in 1960, with a population increase of nearly 10,000. So we're not seeing a huge loss of population in these areas. And hypothetically, people still need to get to work. They still need to be able to do their shopping. They may want to, go to a different neighborhood. They still need access to transportation. So we'll talk about these closures on the Lake Street and then Kenwood branch. And I want to talk about Lake Street first. So the near west side was exponentially growing when the Lake Street line opened in 1892, 1893. The near west side was annexed early in Chicago's history. It was the first west side neighborhood in Chicago. Settlement occurred in the community area's eastern end as early as 1830 by Irish immigrants who built small cottages near the Chicago River. The Irish were soon followed by German, Czechs, Bohemians, and French immigrants. Polish immigrants settled further north along the river in present-day Westtown. If you've ever been to Polonia Triangle, or even along Milwaukee Avenue, there's a huge Polish history there. They worked in factories and on the railroad, while the Danish, Norwegians, and Russian Jews populated what is now Humboldt Park, and Italians settled the area currently known as East Garfield Park. Settlement continued into the 1840s, including Chicago's very first African-American settlement in the northwest quadrant of the near west side. The settlement was located between present-day Lake and Kinsey Streets and was composed of fugitive slaves as well as freedmen. Westward development was additionally encouraged by the opening of the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, as well as Bull's Head Stockyards, both Chicago's first railroad and first stockyards in 1848. Again, shameless plug, come on the Kinsey Industrial Corridor tour. Over the next 2 decades, the area continued its transformation as it experienced an influx of over 200,000 people, creating a very densely populated and overcrowded conditions in the community. In the 1870s and 1880s, businesses and manufacturers were located on the north portion of the community area along east-west streets, including Lake, Kinsey, and Hubbard, which at the time was known as Austin. 3- and 4-story commercial buildings, each housing several business establishments, lined these streets and created a dense center of employment opportunities. And now, for the first time, these early elevated lines provided mass and rapid transportation services from the central business district to the west side. And there's some really interesting photos kind of as we go through this. If you look at the traffic photo of Sacramento and Lake in 1939, and then Lake and Oakley in 1939. And then if you've been on the near west side, and I'm talking west of Damon in more recent time, think about the juxtaposition in your mind as we go through this. But what happens when all these transportation improvements, Wait, did I skip ahead? Probably, because I'm like losing myself. So excited. I did by one paragraph. See, this is why I have notes. So we enter the 20th century, and the Near West Side now has 3 railroads, both with freight and passenger services, supplemented by 2 rapid transit lines. And if you also in the Lake Street folder, so the Met and obviously the Lake Street elevated Met in the Near West Side, and there's a few great photos of the Lake Street transfer station, which was essentially the lines were stacked on each other, and then you could access either one. It's kind of what we have at in the Loop today, but much earlier. And now industry was set to thrive in the Near West Side with the freight and, you know, access to working class residents of the area, as well as the surrounding neighborhoods along the Met and Lake Street L lines. Easily, raw materials and finished goods could easily be imported and exported along the freight lines that served the area. And you now had a whole new industrial sector that fed the economic health of the Near West Side and adjacent East Garfield Park. But so what happens when we remove all of these transportation improvements that initially led to the expansive growth of the community? If you have, as I mentioned, if you've been on the West Side recently, it's very desolate. But you can see what it wasn't always like, and that's really the scar of white flight, subsequent disinvestment, of which the CTA is part of, and I'll tell you why in a second, and then urban renewal. Within 5 years of the CTA's consolidation, 9 stations closed on the Lake Street elevated. This included Racine, Morgan, the Lake Street transfer, and then Damon, Oakley, Campbell, Sacramento, Costner, and Menard. Hamlin followed before the close of the 1950s. And then closures stopped for a few decades, but picked up again in the 1990s with the closure of Halstead and Homan, cutting down service of the line in half. The initial set of closures in the late 1940s left gaping holes in the Near West Side transportation infrastructure. If you look at what closing all the stations from Ashland to California means, it's a 1.5-mile walk between the two. Not everyone had a car at the time. Not everyone has a car now to get to work, or even, you know, if you're commuting between downtown and the Near West Side or another neighborhood, because industry was located all over. So you could really, you know, jobs can be anywhere, and not everyone has access to personal transportation. Or if you go grocery shopping, you know, or you know, still we're not at the time, we're starting to see chain grocery stores and, you know, larger stores like Jewel Osco, but we're still at a time where you have to go to get your produce, your bakery, your dry goods. We're not quite there yet where you're going to one store. And as the L continues to dwindle, your stores are going to continue to close due to dwindling sales and loss of customers who can't easily access them. And you know, we're only talking about L lines today, and some of you may be thinking, well, what about buses? You can get around with buses, and well, CTA cut those too, and that's a whole nother thing, and we're not they cut a lot of bus lines, and you know, and there's still communities that are trying to, you know, simply get a bus line to help them get around easier. So eventually you lose all of these transportation improvements that helped build the community in the 19th century, and you get what we see along Lake Street today. It's nearly nothing. It's, you know, that's what widespread demolition looks like, and especially across the south and west sides. We don't see that on the north side as we do on the south and west sides. And that was the last quarter of the 20th century. So, and that's part of that urban renewal legacy where vacant buildings were deteriorated, they were looked at as hazards, where illicit activity was happening, and the city preferred to have vacant lots and essentially demo all of the built environment instead. What I think is the most interesting about this is that CTA has actually been reintroducing some of these stations. So in 2012, we had the reintroduction of Morgan. That was one of the initial stations that closed in 1949, I believe. And now we have the Damon station, which is also an original station that was closed and is currently planned and hopefully should be under construction. If it's not, it soon will be. But why are these stations coming back now? So Morgan was important because you have a increase in interest in investment and in gentrification of Fulton Market. And you need, a station to get essentially hip white people to Fulton Market. And now as that development and gentrification of Fulton Market is moving west, then now you have the need for Damon and you have the United Center. But mind you, I just love the name of it. It's the Madhouse on Madison. Before it was the United Center. Something's always been there. You've always had that arena for an extended period of time. So it's not anything new. But now you have this redevelopment in Fulton Market pushing west, and people want to see new stations at Damon. So it's not, and it's like the people really, people did eventually leave the west side because there was very little for them there. But people have always been there and they needed access to transportation. But CTA didn't feel that way during the mid-20th century. So that's an example of extensive station closures which impacted, large swaths of the west side. And then to get into, the closing of a branch, we'll focus on the Kenwood branch. So to get back on the south side and talking about disinvestment during that second peak of the Great Migration, of which the closure of the Kenwood branch is part of. So at the height of the Great Migration in the mid-20th century, the landscape of the surrounding neighborhoods began to transform. Key public improvements that had helped the community flourish began to be removed and would ultimately contribute to the decline of what's known as the Black Metropolis, as the community's economic and cultural center, an encompassing built environment across, we're focusing on Kenwood, Douglas, and Grand Boulevard community areas, though it extends much further south than that. The economy of Chicago's I haven't even finished my first one.
You gotta catch up. All
right, let's go. 2. Yes. I know it's so little. I feel like it's so ginormous with this little thing. Anyways, so over those ensuing years of the mid-20th century, you start to see the built environment of these areas decline. The economy of Chicago's Black metropolis peaked by the mid-1920s, after which development activity lessened due to a sharp decline in the new population. Jobs had not kept pace with the population increase during the Great Migration and would fall further behind as migrants continued to arrive from the southern states through the mid-20th century, resulting in large-scale unemployment that impacted the businesses supported by the community. Time for a sip. Additionally, the expansion of chain stores, which just started in the 1920s, including National Tea, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, and Kroger, created increased competition for small businesses across the city. And it would only continue again, and if you come on McKinley Park tour, Patty talks about that. So again, shameless plug. And then finally, the Great Depression struck in 1929. It closed many of the banks and insurance companies that provided credit and professional services to Black businesses in the Black metropolis. By the mid-1930s, storefronts along the commercial thoroughfares of 35th, 39th, 43rd, and 47th Streets remained vacant and began to deteriorate as unemployment and poverty enveloped the community. By the 1930s, the community also became the site of early urban renewal efforts, such as the construction of the now demolished Ida B. Wells homes in 1939 to 1941 by the Chicago Housing Authority. As the economy struggled to gain its footing following World War II, cuts to public infrastructure and improvements also struck the Black metropolis. In 1949, the 31st and 39th Street stations of the South Side Elevated, or the Alley L, were closed as part of the CTA's institution of an AB skip stop service on the north and south routes. So obviously the It's just that it's, skipping a station until they essentially closed the station altogether and maybe demolished it. By 1950, the Illinois Central Railroad, a huge development catalyst for this area in the late 1850s, closed its passenger depots at 35th, 39th, and 43rd Streets, cutting off part of the area's access to and from the rest of the city and suburbs. Today, there are no stations serving the community from 27th Street to the 51st, 53rd Street station in Hyde Park. The opening then of the Kennedy Expressway in 1960 and the Stevenson Expressway in 1964 created physical barriers which further isolated the community from downtown to the north and its neighboring communities to the west, like Canaryville, Back of the Yards, Fuller Park, and New City. And as urban renewal efforts continued and white flight took hold in the 1960s, the broader South Side community saw heavy disinvestment. The storefronts, residences, clubs, theaters, I'll talk over it, it's okay. I got 2 mics. Clubs, theaters, and halls, which once resonated with the sounds of the Black metropolis, fell silent. Buildings fell into disrepair and extensive demolition occurred. Almost 3 miles of residences, businesses, and community institutions were demolished along State Street for the construction of public housing projects, as well as the campus of IIT. Extensive demolition also occurred along the commercial corridors and interior residential streets as the deteriorating built environment was demolished in favor of vacant lots, leaving gaping holes in the community. So how does the Kenwood branch fit into this disinvestment? Well, to go back a little, the story of the Kenwood line begins 43 years before it opened, and with another railroad entirely, the Union Stockyards and Transit Company, chartered in 1864 to build a central stockyards facility, and the next year that facility, which became the infamous Chicago Stockyard. Of course, I would think in industry, don't be. Of course. So to serve the busy stockyards, a network of rail lines were constructed within the stockyards complex, as well as an east-west line paralleling and adjacent to 40th Street, from the yards to the Illinois Central Railroad near 43rd Street in Oakenwald Avenue. It is this line that begins the story of the Kenwood branch. Although this was largely intended as a freight line for interchange traffic between the yards and various connecting railroads, as early as 1882, passenger service was also being run on the line with stations at Lake Park, Cottage Grove, Langley, Vincennes, Grand Boulevard, which is now King Drive, Indiana, and Michigan, to connect the stockyards, Kenwood locals, as well as service to LaSalle Street Station downtown, and then some Illinois Central ran as far south as Riverdale through this kind of connecting infrastructure. And by 1898, some stockyard shuttles actually went to Indiana so that passengers could transfer to the south side elevated there, so Indiana Avenue. Kenwood passenger service continued until 1904, when outside pressures allowed the L to enter into the story. In March 1903, the Chicago City Council passed an ordinance requiring the elevation and grade separation of the 40th Street line. 40th Street is Oakwood Boulevard today. This was part of a larger effort by the city to eliminate grade crossings to increase safety and improve traffic flow all over the city. So in the general history folder, not to make people flip back and forth, but there is a really cute photo of the Howard Street station, and it's at grade and it's so tiny, and you would not ever think Howard looked like that before. Also the Kimball Street station. So cute. So cute. It's so cute. Not a word I usually use, but it really is. It's better than the little golf club sculptures today, but yeah.
Come on, Albany Park Tour if you want to hear me.
Another shameless plug, Albany Park Tour. So at this time, the Chicago Junction Railway, the successor of the Union Stockyards and Transit Co., decided that they did not want to be responsible for operating passenger service anymore and passed it on to the South Side Elevated, who would integrate the lines into the L system. The Chicago Junction Railroad would construct the elevated right-of-way for both the L and freight lines, provide stations, and acquire whatever other real estate would be needed for the L service though. So they basically built all of the infrastructure, but did not operate it. So it was like, here you go, here's everything you need to do this. The South Side Elevated was responsible for providing rolling stock, their own yards, a terminal, and an electrical distribution system. The Kenwood branch, as it is now known today, extended eastward from the Indiana station to a terminal at 42nd Place and Oakenwald Avenue. This is precarious for myself, so we're going to move that. So we're down here in kind of the second to last little offshoot of a black dotted line, and it basically came off of the main green line. What is the main green line today? And it went almost to the lake. And if you're in the Kenwood branch folder, the terminal on the lake is just something I wish I could have experienced, but I was clearly born in the wrong era, because the terminal is literally on the lake. Like, the trains are hanging over Lake Michigan, which is just so cool, and I'm so happy someone took a photo of it. On September 30th, 1903, the Chicago Junction Railroad and the Southside Elevated signed a 50-year lease with options of 2 50-year renewals and an option to buy. One clause said that if the Elevated failed to make lease payments to the Chicago Junction for a period of 6 months, it could seize the property and operate it on its own. So there's that. We're going to build it for you, but remember, it's still ours. And if you screw up, we're going to take it back. The Kenwood branch eventually opened a few years later in September 1907 with 5 stations. The branch, which leaves the Southside Main Line at Indiana Avenue and 40th Street, is built on a solid fill embankment, except for short sections of steel elevated structure at the west end, where the line connected to the Southside Elevated and 42nd Place Terminal and yard east of Lake Park Avenue. So it's essentially built like our parts of our red line today. So far north on the red line, we have an elevated embankment. And then around this area, we did have a steel elevated structure until now we have a ginormous concrete structure. But I have no feelings on the design of that at all. The embankment contained 3 tracks. The north track, which had no third rail and was for the Chicago Junction Railroad's freight trains, while the middle and south track had a third rail for electrification and were for Kenwood branch trains only. While the line expanded and saw success during the first 2 decades of existence, problems began in the 1930s due to the Depression. The Chicago Junction began to defer maintenance on the line, which led to constant battles with the elevated line to ensure the Chicago Junction was maintaining their end of the agreement. Because the junction wasn't maintaining their end of the agreement and maintenance on the line, the elevated line decided to stop making lease payments, which, as hopefully you remember, that once the elevated deferred their payments, the entire agreement could be voided and the elevated essentially evicted. The Chicago Junction attempted to evict the L Company, which is now the Chicago Rapid Transit Company, but this was stayed by the federal bankruptcy court. Eventually, the junction realized there was nothing they could really do. So not only did the court prevent the eviction, but they didn't own the rolling stock or power distribution to operate the line. Should they have chosen to exercise that clause, or should they have chosen to exercise that clause? So they really wouldn't have been able to operate the line without the L because they didn't own the power distribution. And so I guess that's a win for the elevated and smart thinking on them. So the junction kind of just kept quiet, apart from an occasional brief to the court regarding, their unpaid rent. Meanwhile, the elevated did what minimal maintenance was needed to keep the line going and deducted this from the rent owed. In 1947, the CTA took over assets of the Chicago Rapid Transit Company and assumed operation of the Kenwood branch along with many others. When the CTA took over, the equation changed. The authority quickly decided that the Kenwood route had no real future. But remember, we had an intake of almost 30,000 people in population during this time. And since they also now controlled the surface system, they could substitute the service with more economical buses, which they also did cut. In 1949, as part of the large north-south service revision, the Kenwood branch was made into a shuttle, as it previously operated before the elevated train line, running between 42nd Place and Indiana. Over the next decade, the high cost of improvement and unreasonable rent payments, along with a continually dwindling ridership, according to CTA's history, caused the branch to close on November 30th, 1957, upon the expiration of the original 50-year lease. After the Kenwood service was abandoned, all the stations were sealed with brick at street level and with steel plates over the stairs on the platforms. But by and large, the line was left intact. So in the Kenwood branch, there's a recent picture I took that it just looks like concrete covered in murals. But what's really interesting is that there's a station in there, because all of the stations were in the embankment, and it's just been boarded up since 1957. So I would love to take a hammer or, you know, something and open that. Let's go. And there's also some photos in there of the interior of these stations as well, right before they closed. I think the photos are from 1955, and the stations closed in 57. The Chicago Junction did continue to use their track, their single track for freight, but their days were numbered as well, since their main customer, the stockyards, were closing. And the single freight track stayed intact for several years and about into the mid-1960s. Ownership of the right-of-way was assumed by a number of railroads over the years, including the Penn Central, Conrail, and CXX. And simultaneously, around the same time that the Kenwood branch closed, because the stockyards were dwindling, the stockyard branch also closed. So it was really interesting that Kenwood was a sibling of the Stockyards branch. Obviously, the Chicago Junction was the successor of the Union Stockyards and Transit Company, which operated the line. And they had a line into the stockyards that ran a circle through the stockyards. So in the general history folder, there are several photos of the different stockyard stations, as well as an aerial view of the line as well. And so that closed simultaneously, and now all of your kind of branches east and west off of South Side Main Line were gone, and there was no transportation off of this line, especially as bus lines continue to be consolidated and close. But we're going to end on a happy note. So, because that was a lot of, sadness, not access to transportation, community infrastructure essentially dying and being demolished. So here we are. Today there's actually an initiative to transform the abandoned elevated embankment into a 2-mile park and pedestrian trail similar to the 606. The elevated trail would start near 40th and Dearborn Streets and go east to 41st Street and Lake Park Avenue. A block away, an access point from the 41st Street pedestrian bridge would connect to the lakefront trail. They've started some initial feasibility studies and conceptual design scenarios with engineers for where they could kind of access the line and what needs to happen to make sure it's stable. And they've also began some community engagement. This initiative actually starts at least 2 decades ago with the Bronzeville Trail Task Force, which was organized in 2000. And most recently, they actually launched a GoFundMe this past November to help fund their operations, as well as new programming, including their Major Taylor initiative, which is to recognize Major Taylor as the first African American to become the cycling champion of the world. And he also earned the title of World's Fastest Man. He was also a resident of Chicago for the last 2 years of his life. And so that's one initiative that they're working on funding to recognize Major Taylor. They're also working on a Bronzeville Trail History Project and a 2023 Summer Applied Science program that encourages high school age students to consider architecture and engineering as a career. Since November, they've only raised $1,000 of a $100,000 goal. So I will say I have no affiliation with the group. Besides that, I love the project and the idea of it. But obviously, I would encourage you to check out their webpage. And if you can, make a donation in support of their initiatives if you're so moved to. It is the Bronzeville Trail Task Force. Yeah, of course. And if you're interested in learning more, many of the photos came from chicago-l.org. Someone, Graham Garfield, this lovely man, has organized essentially all of the transit history, not only of the elevated, but the bus lines as well. And it's all on this one spectacular website that you can spend days, weeks, months lost in. If you're interested, I would encourage you to check out more, especially he has it organized with some of the by the abandoned lines as well. And everything's organized by line and station. So it's really cool. Highly recommend to check it out. And that's just a little bit about abandoned transit and the history of prior to CTA.
Questions.
Yeah.
I got a question about your favorite guys, Yerkes. What do you think about him? Because he sounds to me like very much a scam artist.
He was. Yeah. Oh, sure. I was asked what I think of Yerkes, and yes, he was definitely a scam artist. He had money, kind of, and he was really good at talking people into.
Remind us who you're talking about?
Sure. So Charles Tyson Yerkes, he was a businessman and kind of, we'll say elevated railroad baron. He was one of the main players behind, or the main player behind the creation of the Union Loop elevated, also had a part in the Lake Street elevated and the Northwestern elevated line. And he also is partially responsible for London's transit system as well.
I know from Wisconsin with the Yerkes Observatory. I thought it was funny that something was named after him after all his scandal. So.
Money speaks, right?
He must have paid for his name to be put on there.
Yeah.
Can you talk about Metro for a bit? I know that it's a separate line, but just thinking about some of these abandoned stations, like the Kenwood one. I mean, those are Metro tracks now, and there is a train that connects downtown to Kenwood.
Yeah. So the question was if I can talk about Metra a little bit and their stations and their lines. So my understanding with Metra is Metra runs over several previous tracks, primarily that were like freight railroad tracks and not necessarily CTA tracks. And so they do run over a portion of the Illinois Central, but they have not brought back any of the stations that that were lost along, like in Kenwood, Douglas, Oakland, Grand Boulevard. All of those stations remain gone. So they didn't really bring any back, and they don't really run over necessarily CTA tracks. They run over like the Rock Island, the Chicago Rock Island Pacific line, at least formerly the Illinois Central, and all of those. And they lease, I believe, a lot of their rights to those tracks because they're owned by now the big conglomerates like Norfolk Southern or CXS or CN Canadian, Union Pacific, those types of really large entities.
We have an online question regarding line and station closures. How close did Chicago get to tearing down the loop elevated tracks?
Very close. This is a great story about Jane Byrne, our wonderful former mayor. So there was a huge initiative to remove the loop elevated, I think in the 70s, 80s, maybe a little bit earlier. It did not get there, but Jane Byrne essentially allegedly put everyone in a room, was the only one to order lunch, smoked a cigarette, and said, basically said, we're not doing it, figure it out. Allegedly, obviously I was not there, but
Even a woman can do.
yeah. Yes. So yeah, there was a huge push in the mid to late 20th century to remove the loop, elevated, really focus on subways. So we almost, I can't imagine a Chicago without the loop, but we came very close to that. And so after that, then you see some minor rehabilitation in existing loop stations. So like in the 1980s, you had the really the reconstruction of the Quincy station. And then you also had the removal of some stations as well. So if you've ever been to Rebuilding Exchange, they have maybe the Madison station in their, in kind of their just set up for display because it was salvaged. But yeah, so we definitely almost lost the loop.
And yet she got a car interchange named after her.
It should be the Burn Loop. Jane's Loop.
The loop already burned.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah.
So with a lot of the lines more on the south side, it seems that were closed. It sounds like the CTA was blaming low ridership and things like that. There's obviously a lot of history of all kinds of political and racial kind of issues in Chicago. Do they have records of like what the ridership numbers or revenue were for those areas? Were they actually dwindling? How much would you say was due to racial issues versus actually costing the money to run those stations?
Yeah. So the question was essentially, are there statistics that show how much ridership was actually dwindling at that time? Does CTA have those statistics? Do we know them? Reviewing CTA history, all it says is dwindling ridership. There's no stats. So that's why
Population's going up, and they're like, no, it's
not
impacting us.
So that's why I kind of went through and I looked at those community areas to see, was population really dwindling? And a specific population was dwindling, but in other areas you had a significant increase of population. They may have that, and it might not. I'm sure they probably do have that somewhere, and it might just not be publicly available right now. Yeah, Steph.
Was the L ever racially segregated?
So the question was the L ever racially segregated? I have never read anything that the L was racially segregated, but that does not, I guess, mean that it wasn't. I just have not read it in any primary sources. And then John.
This is not a history question. If it's present, someday it will be history. Can you talk about the what is
The flyover?
Flyover, yeah.
Sure. So the question is, can I talk about the flyover? Yes. So the Brown Line flyover is part of this red-purple modernization of, obviously, the red-purple, technically brown lines too. I don't know why it's not in there. But of the red, purple, and brown lines. And so my understanding from working on the project is that essentially red line trains cannot enter or exit Belmont when a brown line needs to cross over the tracks. And so they've created this flyover for
10 billion or what?
Oh, well, there's a lot of money for brown line trains to go over the red and purple tracks so service can continue uninterrupted. And my understanding is that it was a very small amount of time that service.
4 minutes.
No, I think it was less than 4. It was like 1 minute. It was like 30 to 60 seconds. So you have a several $billion project. And for 30 seconds to 60 seconds. And I would much rather, so our office is in Evanston, I would much rather see Howard Street get transfers under control than the flyover, because they don't seem to know how to work transfers. But that's kind of the gist of the flyover. And then for the modernization part, essentially they're rebuilding the red and purple lines north of Lawrence to Ardmore Street, which I've had the privilege, because I live right on Ardmore Street, of right next to the L, watching everything. So, and watching my lovely Ardmore viaduct go away, and the original sidewalk stamp when the sidewalk was put in. My poor heart. It's interesting because it's, I don't know the full plans for how they're rebuilding it, but like we still have a portion of our embankment intact on our alley, and one side of the embankment will be completely left intact. So it will be this kind of Frankenstein of new and old, where the embankment might be a little bit too much to demolish cost-wise, and they're leaving part of it intact while building this new concrete structure overhead. And eventually they will move north of Ardmore and go all the way to Howard to modernize all of the entire line. And it's really focused on accessibility as well. So, and code upgrades, because building codes have changed obviously since the L was first built. So widening platforms, making sure there's elevators for accessibility, and then new stations as well. And there'll be new stations at Lawrence, Argyle, Berwyn, and Bryn Mawr. And then for Bryn Mawr, there will also be a station at Hollywood.
We have an online question that kind of builds upon that. With so many workers still working full-time remote or hybrid, and the CTA running like crap lately, do you feel the creation of new stations will continue, or do you think CTA will reevaluate if it is cost-effective in keeping low-performing stations open? Re-in for the 50s again.
I don't know. I guess I don't know. Well, I think they're committed to extending the line. You know, I think about what they're doing on the Red Line North, and then they're also working on the Red Line extension south, that will basically go to Altgeld Gardens at around 130th, 131st, which is just 7 blocks shy of the most southern boundary of Chicago at 138th, near Riverdale. So I know they are working on expanding the line, and obviously they are putting in additional stations, at least as part of this Red Line modernization. And I think they're constantly reevaluating what they need, what ridership needs. And I like to think it's a slightly different approach than what was happening within the first 5 years of them taking on all of the Chicago rapid transit lines. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, so it seems that it was the transportation only concentrated on the east side of Chicago, but the west side was totally forgotten. Because like you said, they have built one there like by Costner, but it's no longer there. So why was the reason that they forgot about the west side and they focused so much? Was it because of businesses, or what was?
Yeah. So the question is, why was there so little on the west side? So if we look at, I guess, at this map, which is circa 1933, there is a huge gap kind of between the Lake Street elevated and then the Logan Square branch, until you really get the Jefferson Park extension and the O'Hare extension. And I think in this area, which let me see if I can read I probably look like crazy reading these. Thank you. I'm like, oh, my glasses, new glasses. I think it's less that they weren't focused on the west side, but I think these areas were still developing at this time. So like I know, for instance, Galewood, because I'm working on a project there. Where is it? Like Montclair and Galewood there. Those areas didn't really develop until, especially those two, because until like the late 1920s, 1930s, when you had new industry coming in, like the Mars factory. And so you had, at this time, those areas were still developing in terms of like a residential population that was staying there and workers that needed to commute. So you just had a limited need. And obviously this map stops at 1933, and it also doesn't show suburban like commuter lines, but also through these areas you have several like Metra, what is Metra today, that would have served those areas and would be able to bring people in and out of the city. But in terms of rapid transit, there wasn't a need in this area quite yet. Yeah.
So I have a question for you when you were talking about Jane Byrne. Was she the one responsible? Because I remember a lot of the lines, like they created the pink line and they changed the names. I remember as a kid, like the blue line used to be AB stations and the line used to split. It was a lot more confusing. That was kind of the 80s, wasn't it?
Late 80s were confusing.
That's another topic.
In the 90s?
Yeah, I think the color system was in the 90s.
It was the 90s. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were trying to make it easier for people to understand, especially if English wasn't their first language.
Yeah.
Okay, so then one.
Yeah. So the question, just for the online folks, was about the color system and if it was related to Jane Byrne and when the color coded system for the L and when it came about. And I believe that was the 90s.
Yeah,
I think it was. I remember the signs in the L.
Yeah.
They changed them.
We have another online question. Can you speak to historic preservation efforts with the RPM project, or if you want to speak broadly to all these historic stations, they're murdering, improving.
Sure. So I can speak to preservation about the RPM because we're the historic preservation consultant. So our involvement with RPM kind of started after, so not to get into too much minutia, but because the project is federally funded, there's a specific regulatory process that the project has to go through. So out of that process, there was a memorandum of agreement put together between the FTA, the CTA, the State Historic Preservation Office, several consulting parties like Landmarks Illinois, Preservation Chicago, and then there were, in that memorandum of agreement, MOA, there were several items that needed to be addressed. So saying you're going to demolish, because one of the big impacts of this was demolishing the historic line. Around the Brown Line flyover, there were, I think, 16 buildings demolished. Farther north and not all of them were historic. There was one or two that I know the community would have liked to see save, at least maybe as like what we call a facadectomy, where you keep the facade of a building but you build new behind. And then farther north on like the modernization side of it, there were much fewer buildings demoed. So because of all of this kind of, essentially demolition happening, as part of this MOA, CTA kind of had to do several things to equal, to basically make up for demolishing some historic buildings. And so one of those things was the relocation of the Vaux Traverse, which obviously cost several million to just move it 30 feet. And so we were part of that and designed kind of the relocation for it, along with the building movers and engineers, obviously. And then we were also, I will say, we were supposed to be a preservation consultant on the new design for the stations, though we ended up having much less involvement than we anticipated we would have. So the new station design is not my responsibility. And they do not, I would say, as a community member of Edgewater, they don't fit with the neighborhood context. I encourage you to look up the designs and yeah. And then one of the other big things was for the modernization side, our firm was part of the transit-oriented development plans around Lawrence, Argyle, and Bryn Mawr, which correspond to 3 historic districts in the city. And so we wrote, as an appendix to the transit-oriented plans, and you can find all these documents on CTA's website on the project page. We wrote preservation plans for each district. And essentially it provides a history of each district, common building typologies, architectural styles, so understanding the historic built environment, and then design guidelines to guide private property owners who choose to rehabilitate their building and hopefully do it the right way. So as Patty would be very proud, don't paint your masonry. Here's how to clean it. Here's how you can restore those windows. And so all those guidelines were in the preservation plans. And then our last piece was actually for the Uptown Square Historic District, the West Argyle Street Historic District, and the West Bryn Mawr Historic District. All of those districts were, I think Bryn Mawr was the 80s or 90s. Uptown Square was written in early 2000s. West Argyle was a little bit more recent, but we updated all of those, essentially the National Register nominations. We updated them all to bring them into present day. And then as part of the National Register, each district has a period of significance. And so we updated that. And we got to, for West Argyle Street, we got to bring in a few more buildings that were mid-20th century that didn't qualify before. And one of them is a Jewel Osco, which I love. And it's on Sheridan, and it's original Jewel Osco. And once you see that building, you'll see Jewel Oscos everywhere. And so they did have several preservation initiatives they had to kind of follow as part of the RPM. So, yeah.
So during your presentation, you talked a lot about just like the disinvestment of CTA through the 50s and 60s. And one project that's been relevant lately during the aldermanic races is in Inglewood off the Ashland branch. So I don't know if you can talk anything at all about the Racine Station perhaps reopening, but there's a lot of community support behind that right now, and they just passed a referendum in their ward regarding it. So
yeah, so the question was if I can talk a little bit about kind of the discussion that's going on about the reopening of the Racine Station that was on the Inglewood branch. And I will say, unfortunately, I don't know much about it. My knowledge kind of stops at my, historically. And kind of stops with the extension of the line to Ashland in 1969. So I'm not up with, unfortunately, with everything that's going on there now, but I will look into it because I would like to know. So thank you for letting me know about that.
We can take 1 to 2 more questions.
I think. Yeah, you haven't asked the question yet. You can ask me one afterwards, John.
I've always felt like transit, unless you're going downtown, you have to take 2 things to get somewhere. And it's always felt a little piecemeal, and I feel hearing that they were franchised, that makes so much sense to me, because they were set up and then they connected them. Was that a common way that cities in that era were setting up things, or did they go about it we want to build mass transit for our city from square one?
Sure. So the question was if during the era of the beginning of mass transportation in urbanized areas, if a lot of cities use franchises where you have essentially individual entities running one line. I'm not sure really outside of the Midwest, but I believe that's the kind of standard approach to it, because a lot of times cities were still new. They didn't necessarily have the funding to build an entire mass transportation system, and so they really relied on private industrialists and businessmen to build those lines. I mean, and if you look at railroads with freight and passenger service, it was really all started by 1 or 2 guys, in the grand scheme. Yeah, yes, and always white guys, to kind of, and you relied on them to build it, and in turn, they would build it because they believed they would get kind of a profit and a return back on it. So it's not like they were necessarily building it for the good of the city, but it was something they were interested in. They saw a need and they built. Yeah. Yeah. Great questions. Thank you. Oh, you need.
This is complicated equipment, folks.
I'm gonna.
All right, folks, give it up one more time for Erica. Wow. I feel like I needed a whiteboard to get all those numbers straight. That was great.
That's why I have my white pieces of paper to keep me straight.
I appreciate that. Well, folks, thanks for joining us tonight, whether it was in person or online. Family reminder, we are a small volunteer organization. Your donations go far with us. It helps us keep the programming going, pay our fabulous speakers to come out and spend, hours, months, years of your life researching. I don't know. That was a very thoroughly researched presentation, folks. Thanks for all being here, and we'll see you next week.